4. All countries will be affected. Once a fully contagious virus emerges, its global spread is considered inevitable. Countries might, through measures such as border closures and travel restrictions, delay arrival of the virus, but they cannot stop it. The pandemics of the previous century encircled the globe in 6 to 9 months, even when most international travel was by ship. Given the speed and volume of international air travel today, the virus could spread more rapidly, possibly reaching all continents in less than 3 months. 5. Widespread illness will occur. Because most people will have no immunity to the pandemic virus, infection and illness rates are expected to be higher than during seasonal epidemics of normal influenza. Current projections for the next pandemic estimate that a substantial percentage of the world's population will require some form of medical care. Few countries have the staff, facilities, equipment, and hospital beds needed to cope with large numbers of people who suddenly fall ill. 6. Medical supplies will be inadequate. Supplies of vaccines and antiviral drugs, the two most important medical interventions for reducing illness and deaths during a pandemic, will be inadequate in all countries at the start of a pandemic and for many months thereafter. Inadequate supplies of 72. Infectious diseases. Vaccines are of particular concern, as vaccines are considered the first line of defense for protecting populations. On present trends, many developing countries will have no access to vaccines throughout the duration of a pandemic. 7. Large numbers of deaths will occur. Historically, the number of deaths during a pandemic has varied greatly. Death rates are largely determined by 4 factors: the number of people who become infected, the virulence of the virus, the underlying characteristics and vulnerability of affected populations, and the effectiveness of preventive measures. Accurate predictions of mortality cannot be made before the pandemic virus emerges and begins to spread. All estimates of the number of deaths are purely speculative. WHO has used a relatively conservative estimate, from 2 million to 7.4 million deaths, because it provides a useful and plausible planning target. This estimate is based on the comparatively mild 1957 pandemic. Estimates based on a more virulent virus, closer to the one seen in 1918, have been made and are much higher. However, the 1918 pandemic was considered exceptional. 8. Economic and social disruption will be great. High rates of illness and worker absenteeism are expected, and these will contribute to social and economic disruption. Past pandemics have spread globally in 2 and sometimes 3 waves. Not all parts of the world or of a single country are expected to be severely affected at the same time. Social and economic disruptions could be temporary, but may be amplified in today's closely interrelated and interdependent systems of trade and commerce. Social disruption may be greatest when rates of absenteeism impair essential services, such as power, transportation, and communications. 9. Every country must be prepared. WHO has issued a series of recommended strategic actions for responding to the influenza pandemic threat. The actions are designed to provide different layers of defense that reflect the complexity of the evolving situation. Recommended actions are different for the present phase of pandemic alert, the emergence of a pandemic virus, and the declaration of a pandemic and its subsequent international spread. Bird flu. 73. 10. WHO will alert the world when the pandemic threat increases. WHO works closely with ministries of health and various public health organizations to support countries' surveillance of circulating influenza strains. A sensitive surveillance system that can detect emerging influenza strains is essential for the rapid detection of a pandemic virus. 6 distinct phases have been defined to facilitate pandemic preparedness planning, with roles defined for governments, industry, and WHO. The present situation is categorized as Phase 3. A virus new to humans is causing infections, but does not spread easily from one person to another. Now do I have your attention? After reading this, I realize the basis instinct is to go buy masks, stock up the shelves with food and water, and hide in the basement, which I did a little myself when I first read reports on this from Foreign Affairs and WHO. If you really want to get spooked, read some of the U.S. government's preparation suggestions, like storing a 2-week supply of water and food, at www.pandemicflu.gov. It's important to understand that although the world is getting prepared for a pandemic, it is far from certain that one is going to occur. This virus has been around since 1901, but we've seen only 3 influenza outbreaks, of which only one caused massive deaths and disruption to society. Each subsequent pandemic was less lethal, as deaths declined from 40 to 50 million in 1918 according to WHO to 2 million in 1957 and to 1 million in 1968. It's this progression that leads us to various scenarios of the potential outbreak of disease. In Chapter 2 on the 1918 H1N1 outbreak, we discussed how the virus mutates as rapid reproduction produces mistakes in the genetic code. These mutations are how that disease progresses and increases its ability to spread, along with its lethality. So far, the avian influenza has remained solely on a bird-to-human transmission schedule. This means that to contract the disease one has to come in direct contact with the birds or their droppings. Direct contact deaths of this kind have occurred in parts of the world that have the closest and most frequent human-to-animal proximity. As we learned from Chapter 4 on SARS, the Far East gets the award for these conditions and Vietnam is the poster child for poultry-human contact. 74. Infectious diseases. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization www.fao.org, approximately half of all Vietnamese households, rural and urban, keep poultry. In the 8 million rural family households, 3 out of 4 typically own chickens and keep backyard flocks. Taking a step back for the entire region, the bird population for the eastern and southeastern parts of Asia is estimated to be around 6 billion birds. Like Vietnam, the region has a large portion of the poultry population in smaller farms. This is important for policy reasons when a government attempts to stem the spread of the disease by culling the birds. In November 2005, China had outbreaks of the disease in 9 different provinces that resulted in the culling of around 20 million birds. To recap, proximity to infected birds is the key determinant for human infection. If this is the case, then the culling would work and stop the spread of the disease. Pretty simple, right? Well, this is where the mutation component of influenza is the problem. Eventually, biologists believe the H5N1 strain will mutate and make the jump from bird to human transmission. This is when the big trouble starts and when the disease can explode into a major killer. Remember, influenza virus is airborne, unlike SARS. Its transmission is immensely facilitated by this feature. Also remember, quarantine will be useless because those who are infected with influenza and contagious can be asymptomatic and appear healthy. In other words, you wouldn't know who to stop and stick in a hospital until it's too late. Of course, if it's like the Spanish flu, those infected could die within 48 hours of getting the disease anyway. Nice thought. The point is that, just like the Spanish flu, an avian flu pandemic would have to burn itself out or mutate itself out rather than be eradicated by any medical prevention and isolation program from a government. Back to the future. A short view of a long timeline. We are going to mention only a few points in the timeline, as there has yet to be a major human avian influenza outbreak and market reaction to it. However, there are some interesting sequences for the development of the disease. This chronology comes from the World Health Organization's website. This timeline starts in 1996, and could reach as far back as 1918. Personally, I didn't take much notice of a potential pandemic until the summer of 2005 when an article by Laurie Garrett in Foreign Affairs called, "The Next Pandemic" came out. Bird flu. 75. The WHO's timeline shows a progression of the disease as avian flu spreads in fowl first and then in humans across the globe. In 3 years, it has worked its way up from Vietnam into China, across to Russia, and into Europe. By the time this book is published, avian flu should be in North America and perhaps human cases will have occurred as well. Also, the virus is mutating, it's infecting not only birds, but also those lovely critters from SARS, civet cats, as well. July 15, 2005. In November 2005, this is what the U.S. Homeland Security Council's National Strategy for Pandemic Influenza had to say. The current pandemic threat stems from an unprecedented outbreak of avian influenza in Asia and Europe, caused by the H5N1 strain of the influenza A virus. To date, the virus has infected birds in 16 countries and has resulted in the deaths, through illness and culling, of approximately 200 million birds across Asia. While traditional control measures have been attempted, the virus is now endemic in Southeast Asia, present in long-range migratory birds, and unlikely to be eradicated soon. A notable and worrisome feature of the H5N1 virus is its ability to infect a wide range of hosts, including birds and humans. As of the date of this document, the virus is known to have infected 121 people in 4 countries, resulting in 62 deaths over the past 2 years. Although the virus has not yet shown an ability to transmit efficiently between humans, as is seen with the annual influenza virus, there is concern that it will acquire this capability through genetic mutation or exchange of genetic material with a human influenza virus. It is impossible to know whether the currently circulating H5N1 virus will cause a human pandemic. The widespread nature of H5N1 in birds and the likelihood of mutations over time raise our concerns that the virus will become transmissible between humans, with potentially catastrophic consequences. If this does not happen with the current H5N1 strain, history suggests that a different influenza virus will emerge and result in the next pandemic. The takeaway here is that if it isn't this strain of influenza, it'll be another one sometime soon, and we had better be ready for it when it happens. Known treatments. Here's what the WHO has to say in the Frequently Asked Questions (FAQs) section on avian influenza, www.int/csr/disease/avian. Influenza avian. FAQs/n/index.html #drugs2. 76. Infectious diseases. 2 drugs in the neuraminidase inhibitors class, oseltamivir, commercially known as Tamiflu, and zanamivir, commercially known as Relenza, can reduce the severity and duration of illness caused by seasonal influenza. The efficacy of the neuraminidase inhibitors depends, among others, on their early administration within 48 hours after symptom onset. For cases of human infection with H5N1, the drugs may improve prospects of survival if administered early, but clinical data are limited. The H5N1 virus is expected to be susceptible to the neuraminidase inhibitors. Antiviral resistance to neuraminidase inhibitors has been clinically negligible so far but is likely to be detected during widespread use during a pandemic. An older class of antiviral drugs, the M2 inhibitors amantadine and rimantadine, could potentially be used against pandemic influenza, but resistance to these drugs can develop rapidly and this could significantly limit their effectiveness against pandemic influenza. Some currently circulating H5N1 strains are fully resistant to these M2 inhibitors. However, should a new virus emerge through reassortment, the M2 inhibitors might be effective. For the neuraminidase inhibitors, the main constraints, which are substantial, involve limited production capacity and a price that is prohibitively high for many countries. At present manufacturing capacity, which has recently quadrupled, it will take a decade to produce enough oseltamivir to treat 20% of the world's population. The manufacturing process for oseltamivir is complex and time-consuming, and is not easily transferred to other facilities. So far, most fatal pneumonia seen in cases of H5N1 infection has resulted from the effects of the virus and cannot be treated with antibiotics. Nonetheless, since influenza is often complicated by secondary bacterial infection of the lungs, antibiotics could be life-saving in the case of late-onset pneumonia. WHO regards it as prudent for countries to ensure adequate supplies of antibiotics in advance. This is important, as Tamiflu and Relenza are singled out as drugs that can reduce the severity and duration of the influenza. Countries around the world are not sitting idly by while a potential pandemic gathers steam. The United States has a national strategy for dealing with an outbreak, which you can review at www.whitehouse.gov/homeland/pandemic-influenza, HTML. Essentially, the U.S. government is in the process of stockpiling drugs and has already ordered 6 million more influenza treatments from Roche Holding AG and GlaxoSmithKline plc to increase the national stockpile to. Bird flu. 77. Figure 5.1 Roche Holding AG source. Used with permission from Bloomberg LP. 26 million, according to Bloomberg. The order includes 3.8 million courses of treatment with Roche's Tamiflu and 2.2 million of Glaxo's Relenza that would be used in case the bird virus changes into a form that's contagious in people. Therefore, we don't even need to have an outbreak occur before society reacts and drug sales are impacted. Figures 5.1 and 5.2 show the charts for both Roche Holding AG and GlaxoSmithKline plc since 2003. The point is that the financial markets are already anticipating the outbreak with a run-up in drug company stocks. These stocks had a banner year in 2005 as the bird flu became more prevalent and the U.S. government began to stockpile their drugs. Evaluating 3 known unknowns scenarios. There are several potential outcomes to the mutation pattern that influenza follows. There is a weak outbreak where only sporadic infections are occurring and the influenza never makes it past the stage of being sporadic. As I mentioned earlier, some scientists believe this is a likely outcome as 78. Infectious diseases. Figure 5.2 GlaxoSmithKline plc. Source. Used with permission from Bloomberg LP. The H5N1 virus has been found in birds for a long period of time and has not made the jump from bird to human transmission to human transmission. A recent study in the magazine Nature has found that humans with H5N1 don't spread the disease easily by just coughing or sneezing, which would mean the strain is not readily transmissible through the air. This would support the theory that a pandemic is not likely to happen with the current strain of H5N1. With this scenario, we would most likely see a sell-off in drug stocks, because the market would have already owned them in anticipation of a big flu outbreak. Next, we could have a mild outbreak that is contained to the Far East. This would potentially mimic the SARS outbreak scenario where it was a short, sharp shock to the system for the area in which the outbreak occurred, but it didn't spread further. We know from Chapter 4 that hotels, airlines, tourism, shopping malls, and entertainment industries are all on the front line for seeing their stock prices decline. Hospitals and healthcare providers would be early winners as their beds get filled beyond their limits. We can also anticipate weaker currencies initially in those countries where the disease spreads. However, this could be a great buying opportunity if we see a larger force at work such as a Federal Reserve easing cycle. And with respect to this would be an overreaction to a perceived outbreak by the central bird flu. 79. Banks around the world and an easing by them to avert a perceived global slowdown stemming from the disease. Investing and trading aren't easy, they're not meant to be. This is why you have to understand the larger forces at work as a mild outbreak occurs and the reactions of government agencies to the perceived risk. To state the obvious, drug companies that have a vaccine or a potential treatment for avian influenza would perform well, and have already seen their sales increase just in anticipation. However, these may not be the best plays. The entire market would benefit from lower interest rates, especially the financial sector, as they would get cheap money from the central bank. This could lead to a short-term pop to the housing market as mortgage rates come down. Let's create a 1918-style outbreak scenario. In this scenario, the outbreak can overwhelm whatever broader financial forces may be at work. It's very likely that we would see aggressive moves by G7, the 7 largest industrialized countries, central banks to ease and supply liquidity into the banking systems to ensure they stay running smoothly and calm fears. This would mean that bond prices would go higher as the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Federal Reserve all add reserves and increased liquidity into the system. This would be especially important should nations decide to shut borders to countries that have had outbreaks and potentially cause a liquidity squeeze for local financial institutions. Not surprisingly, the list of candidates for tuberculosis is going to count in the poorer countries that haven't spent enough money on their healthcare infrastructures. It will coincide with the countries most likely to have the highest human-to-animal contact and the first major outbreak of the pandemic influenza, the Far East. The actions by the central banks should help offset the deflation that could occur should a massive outbreak happen. The risk is that economies will shut down as workers stop showing up over fears of catching the disease. Essentially, labor-intensive industries will be negatively impacted due to this change in behavior. Pandemic emergency planners are predicting absenteeism as 30%. Consumer demand will be negatively impacted as everyone stays home and out of the malls. In this extreme scenario, other industries come into play. Certain service industries, such as UPS and Peapod, could do extremely well. Why? Consumers reluctant to be face-to-face with large numbers of other consumers will shop online to avoid the contact, and somebody's got to deliver the goods. Consequently, online shopping would jump tremendously. Imagine the outbreak occurring during the Christmas season. Or how about during the Super Bowl? Just like during the Black Death when people avoided social gathering places, patrons would avoid bars and stadiums for sporting events. 80. Infectious diseases. And beer and alcohol sales would fall. Telecoms could also benefit should the massive increase in traffic necessitate a huge demand increase for the internet and bandwidth. One more step down this path, home entertainment providers should see demand increase for their goods. Microsoft, Nintendo, Blockbuster, and Netflix would all benefit, as well as producers of flat-screen TVs and other media devices. Those companies that have substantial business in death benefits or life insurance will feel the largest negative impact. On the opposite side, those companies that write annuity policies will see huge rewards. The ultimate hedge trade, then, is to sell companies doing life insurance and buy companies doing annuities. Unfortunately, most insurance companies do both as their own hedge. There is one type of company under the sector of consumer discretionary that would without a doubt do very well. If 1918 is our paradigm, the funeral home business would not be able to keep up with the demand. Service Corporation International (SCI) is an example of a company that would be an excellent hedge against a large drop in the population. It's in the funeral business. Essentially, any company that would be engaged in the cleanup and removal of bodies would be a winner. Party natural disasters. CHAPTER 6. Hurricanes. Ever since Hurricanes Katrina and Rita hit the U.S. Gulf Coast, the financial world has become aware of every tropical depression that forms off Africa between June 1 and November 30. The storms rocked the United States and showed that nature can eventually find and hit the weakest link in the economic armor. Hurricanes are the monsters of the weather world. The fact that they tend to hit exactly where Americans like to live and vacation makes them especially onerous. The fact that they can also hit in an area where much of the country's domestic energy supplies come out of the ground makes hurricanes a disruptive economic force. The name hurricane comes from the Arawak tribe in the Caribbean, who called the storms, evil spirit, or huracan. As Paul Douglas mentions in his book, Restless Skies, these storms inspired so much fear and fascination that living sacrifices were offered centuries ago to appease the ruthless god Huracan, who came from the sea, rarely showing any mercy. While I don't envision going back to that tradition, I think it would be wise to go back to that mindset. Hurricanes are meant to be watched closely and feared. In this chapter, we break down exactly how a storm forms, how a storm is categorized, and where storms hit in the United States. Like infectious diseases, it's important to understand the nature of the beast before we can analyze the impact it will have on the economy and the financial markets. Next, we review 5 major storms of the past 20 years to show the impact of the hurricanes on the areas hit and on the overall economy. Last, we examine the effects the storms had on the financial markets and on individual companies. 83. 84. Natural disasters. NOAA knows best. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration (NOAA), www.noaa.gov, a hurricane is actually defined as a type of tropical cyclone that is shallow pressure system that generally forms in the tropics. Thus large, circular storms form over warm ocean water and rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. The storm converts this heat into energy that feeds the beast and grows the system. Hurricanes can form in both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Hurricanes are behemoths and can grow as large as 700 miles wide. Unlike tornadoes, hurricanes can last for weeks. The eye at a hurricane center is a relatively calm, clear area approximately 20 to 40 miles across. The eye wall surrounding the eye is composed of dense clouds that contain the highest winds in the storm. The storm's outer rain bands, often with hurricane force or tropical storm force winds, are made up of dense bands of thunderstorms ranging from a few miles to tens of miles wide and 50 to 300 miles long. Hurricane force winds can extend outward about 25 miles in a small hurricane and more than 150 miles for a large one. Tropical storm force winds can stretch out as far as 300 miles from the center of a large hurricane. Frequently, the right side of a hurricane is the most dangerous in terms of storm surge, winds, and tornadoes. A hurricane's speed and path depend on complex ocean and atmospheric interactions, including the presence or absence of other weather patterns. This complexity of the flow makes it very difficult to predict the speed and direction of a hurricane. Do not focus on the eye or the track. Hurricanes are immense systems that can move in complex patterns that are difficult to predict. Be prepared for changes in size, intensity, speed, and direction. The last point underscores the big problem with this weather pattern. The experts can't predict precisely where a hurricane will hit with enough time to make a difference. Where do hurricane names come from? According to NOAA, the National Hurricane Center has named Atlantic tropical storms since 1953. The original name lists featured only women's names. In 1979, men's names began alternating with the women's names. Currently, this list is maintained and updated by an international committee. Hurricanes. 85. Of the World Meteorological Organization. 6 lists are used in rotation, which means that the 2005 list will be used again in 2011. So if you think you are experiencing the edge backquote of over one of these hurricanes, you probably are. However, the nastiest and most destructive storms get their names retired, sort of a reverse Hall of Fame, if you will. This retired list includes Andrew and Katrina. Hurricanes are classified by wind speed, central pressure, and damage potential using something called the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. See Table 6.1. Good news, bad news. Let's do a little good news, bad news routine on hurricanes. The good news is that on average only 5 hurricanes hit the United States every 3 years, and on average only 2 of those will be major Category 3 or higher. The bad news is that 2005 was not an average year, as there were 28 named storms, including 15 hurricanes, of which 7 were major and 4 hit the United States: Dennis, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. The good news is that 2006 ended without a major hurricane hitting the United States. The bad news. Table 6.1 Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Scale. Scale. Number. Sustained. Winds category mph. Damage. Storm surge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 74 to 95. 96 to 110. 111 to 130. 131 to 155. More than 155. Minimal. Unanchored mobile homes, vegetation, signs. Moderate. All mobile homes, roofs, small crafts, flooding. Extensive. Small buildings, low-lying roads cut off. Extreme. Roofs destroyed, trees down, roads cut off, mobile homes destroyed. Beach homes flooded. Catastrophic. Most buildings destroyed. Vegetation destroyed. Major roads cut off. Homes flooded. 4 to 5 feet. 6 to 8 feet. 9 to 12 feet. 13 to 18 feet. Greater than 18 feet. Source. Federal Emergency Management Agency FEMA. 86. Natural disasters. Is that the conditions that produce major hurricanes, warmer waters, are still in existence and likely to persist. The good news is that forecasters are getting better at predicting when and where a hurricane will hit. The bad news is that people still ignore the warnings, and local, state, and federal authorities still don't coordinate their activities for the storm. The good news is that over the past century, loss of life has declined with the exception of Katrina, which resulted in approximately 1,300 deaths. The bad news is that more and more people are moving to the areas where hurricanes hit, and that means the property losses are growing with each storm. The worst of the worst. When you take a look at the costliest storms to hit the United States, you can view them in 2 ways: current dollars and normalized dollars. Table 6.2 shows an impressive list of destructive storms and their estimated costs in current dollars from 1900 to 2004. Not on the list is the no-name storm that hit southeast Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama that caused over $100 billion in 2004 dollars. What's interesting is that the list of the top 30 storms includes 7 from 2000 to 2004 and doesn't include 2005's record-breaking year of 4 major storms. Our calculation through 2005 would mean that over 30% of the worst storms in those 106 years have occurred in the last 6 years. Over the past 20 years, the number goes up to 40%. The numbers are even worse when you look at costs unadjusted for inflation. If we include 2005, 70% of the most costly storms occurred in 2004 and 2005. The trend is not your friend when it comes to frequency of storms and the costliness of those storms. Demographics have a lot to do with why the costs of these storms are going up. More and more people are drawn to the allure of living by the sea. Whereas the local Floridian Indian tribes built their villages away from the shores, modern man is doing the opposite. Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, and Georgia get the highest frequency of the costliest storms. The southern states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Maryland round out the next group. The top 6 costliest storms, Andrew, Charley, Ivan, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, all hit those areas. With that in mind, let's examine the top 5 hurricanes in chronological order to see how they developed, how they impacted the country, and how they impacted the financial markets. We'll end with the most surprising twist of all: no major hurricanes hit the United States in 2006. Hurricanes 87 Table 6.2 The 30 costliest mainland U. S. Hurricanes and Tropical Storms 1900-2004 Rank Hurricane Year Category Damage US dollars 1 Andrew SEFL Sella $19,925 $26,500,000,000 2 Charlie SWFL 2,004,415 000 000 000 3 Ivan Al NWFL